In 1893, the city of Chicago threw the greatest party in American history. The world's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair, drew 27 million visitors over 6 months. It was a celebration of American progress, American ambition, and American ingenuity. Electric lights illuminated buildings that had never seen electricity. A machine called the Ferris wheel made its world debut. People came from every corner of the country and every corner of the world to witness what America had become. And just blocks away from the fairgrounds, a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, who called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, was running a hotel. He had built it himself, designed every room, supervised every contractor, insisted on managing the construction personally, cycling through crews so rapidly that no single worker ever understood the full layout of the building. There were gas lines that could be controlled from a central panel. There were rooms that could be sealed airtight. There were chutes that led from the upper floors to the basement. In the basement there was a kiln large enough to cremate a human body. There was a dissection table. There were vats of acid. When investigators finally entered the building in 1894, they called it a castle, a murder castle. H. Holmes is widely considered the first recognized serial killer in American history. He confessed to 27 murders. Some historians believe the true number was closer to 200. He was charming. He was brilliant. He was a trained physician. And he killed with a methodical patience that the investigators who eventually caught him said they had never encountered before and hope never to encounter again. This is his story. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His childhood, by the accounts that survive, was outwardly unremarkable. His family was Methodist, respectable and reasonably comfortable by the standards of rural New England. His father, Levi Mudgett, was a farmer. His mother, Theodate, was devout and attentive. But something was wrong from the beginning. Contemporary accounts describe a child who was unusually isolated, unusually intelligent, and unusually fascinated by things that other children found disturbing. He was bullied in school. What was unusual was his response. Classmates who tormented him had a tendency to suffer accidents, falls, injuries that nobody could quite explain. He married at 19. He enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School and received a legitimate medical degree in 1884. By all academic accounts, he was an excellent student. He was also, during his time at medical school, stealing cadavers from the university morgue, disfiguring them, and using them to fraudulently claim insurance money by staging accidents. This was not impulsive crime. This was planned, methodical, patient. He was not stealing out of desperation. He was experimenting, testing what he could get away with, learning the boundaries of detection and suspicion. He moved to Chicago. He adopted the name H. Holmes. He worked briefly at a pharmacy, charmed the widow who owned it, and when she mysteriously disappeared, took over the business himself. He had not yet built his castle, but the mind that would design it was already fully formed. And Chicago, the fastest growing city in the world, was about to give him exactly what he needed. Holmes began acquiring property in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago in the late 1880s. The lot he chose was at the corner of 63rd Street and South Wallace Avenue, perfectly positioned to capture the flood of visitors who would come to Chicago for the World's Fair. He designed the building himself. The design was elaborate, a mixed-use commercial building with retail space on the ground floor, a pharmacy he would run himself, and a hotel on the upper floors. But the design that Holmes submitted to the city bore only a passing resemblance to what was actually built. Holmes supervised the construction with obsessive attention to detail, but he cycled through contractors with deliberate speed. One crew would be hired, work for a few weeks, and then be dismissed, often without being paid. A new crew would be brought in. They would work on a different section of the building with no knowledge of what the previous crew had done. The result was a building that only one person fully understood: Holmes himself. The hotel floors contained rooms that could be sealed from the outside. Some had gas lines running into them, controlled from a panel in Holmes's private office. Some had no windows at all. Some had doors that opened onto blank walls. The building also had a secret chute system that ran from the upper floors to the basement. The basement contained an operating table, a dissection table, large vats of acid and lime, a cremation kiln, and various surgical instruments. Holmes used the hotel in multiple ways. Some victims were guests who checked in and never checked out. Some were employees. He had a particular pattern of hiring young women as secretaries or assistants, taking out life insurance policies on them shortly after hiring them, and then killing them. What made the murder castle truly extraordinary was not its existence. It was its invisibility. The building stood in a busy commercial neighborhood. Hundreds of people passed it every day. Guests checked in and out. The pharmacy on the ground floor served regular customers. Neighbors knew Holmes by name, greeted him in the street, and considered him a pleasant businessman. Nobody suspected anything. Holmes understood something fundamental about human psychology. People see what they expect to see. A well-dressed physician running a hotel near the World's Fair was not a suspicious figure. He was exactly what Chicago in 1893 was full of. The victims were selected with this invisibility in mind. Holmes gravitated toward people who had recently arrived in the city, young women from out of state looking for work, visitors to the fair who had no local connections, people who would not immediately be missed. But the castle was only part of what Holmes built, because his real genius, and if you can call it that, was something far more dangerous than architecture. To understand H. Holmes, you have to understand that the murders were only part of what he did. Holmes was, at his core, a con artist of extraordinary skill. He was charming in a way that contemporaries struggled to describe without resorting to the language of the supernatural. People who met him described an immediate, overwhelming sense that he was genuinely interested in them, that he understood them, that he was the most attentive, most intelligent person they had ever met. The women Holmes targeted were not naive. They were in many cases educated, capable, and professionally ambitious, which was precisely what made them vulnerable to his particular approach. Holmes did not pursue helpless women. He pursued women who were trying to make their own way in a world that made that very difficult. He positioned himself as someone who could help, a successful businessman, a trained physician, someone with connections and resources. Minnie Williams was a Texas schoolteacher who came to Chicago believing Holmes intended to marry her. She signed over significant property to him shortly after arriving. She and her sister Nanny were both killed. Their bodies were never conclusively identified. Emmeline Seagrand was a stenographer Holmes hired from a sanitarium in Indiana. She came to Chicago full of ambition. She was dead within months. Holmes collected on the insurance policy he had taken out on her life. Julia Smythe was the wife of a pharmacist who worked for Holmes. She fell into an affair with him, became pregnant, and was killed, along with her young daughter, during a supposed medical procedure that Holmes performed himself. These were not random victims. Each one had been studied, assessed, and selected. Holmes understood their financial situations, their family connections or lack thereof, their vulnerabilities. The charm he deployed was not indiscriminate. It was targeted, calibrated. Holmes also had a documented pattern of bigamous marriage. He married multiple women simultaneously in different cities, usually under different names. At the time of his arrest, Holmes had 3 living wives who were aware of his existence. Stop and consider what we're describing. This was not a man driven by rage or passion. Every step was calculated, every victim was chosen, and he operated for years across multiple states without detection. Holmes's downfall came not from the murders, but from the insurance fraud. In 1894, Holmes devised an elaborate scheme involving a man named Benjamin Pitzel, one of his longtime associates. The scheme involved faking Pitzel's death to collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy. The insurance company paid out. The problem was that Holmes then killed Pitzel. Having gotten the insurance money, Holmes apparently decided that a living Pitzel was a liability. He then proceeded to travel across the country with 3 of Pitzel's children, ostensibly to reunite them with their mother. During this journey, Holmes killed 2 of the 3 children. Their bodies were found later in Toronto and Indianapolis. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by the insurance company to investigate the fraud, began to piece together what had happened. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894. When investigators searched the Inglewood building, what they found shook even the experienced detectives who conducted the search. The building yielded human remains, medical equipment, a cremation kiln, acid vats, and the various mechanical systems Holmes had built to control his guests' environments. The full death toll was impossible to establish with certainty. Holmes had been methodical in disposal, and records were incomplete. He eventually confessed to 27 murders, then recanted several confessions, then confessed again to different victims. The investigation was genuinely unprecedented. American law enforcement had no framework for what Holmes had done, and what came next, the trial, would shock the nation all over again. Holmes was tried in Philadelphia in 1895, specifically for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel. He was articulate, he was composed. He disputed evidence methodically and presented himself as a wronged man. It didn't work. He was convicted of first-degree murder on November 2, 1895. He was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, Holmes wrote and sold his confessions to the Hearst newspaper chain, a document that was characteristically a mixture of truth, fabrication, and self-serving distortion. On May 7, 1896, Herman Webster Mudgett, H. Holmes, was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. He was 34 years old. He had requested in advance that his coffin be filled with cement and buried at double depth so that no one could exhume and dissect his body. He who had processed so many others did not want to be processed himself. H. Holmes has cast a long shadow over American culture. He has been the subject of Eric Larson's best-selling book, The Devil in the White City. He has inspired fictional serial killers in countless novels, films, and television series. But his real legacy is more significant than celebrity. Holmes is widely credited with establishing the investigative framework for how America would understand serial killers for generations to come. The techniques developed to investigate his crimes, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, systematic examination of patterns across multiple crimes, the recognition that a single perpetrator might be responsible for seemingly unconnected deaths across a wide geographic area, became foundational to American criminal investigation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit traces its intellectual lineage in part to cases like Holmes's, cases that first established that some killers operated according to patterns, profiles, and psychological logics that can be studied and anticipated. Holmes was also a product of his time. The 1890s were a moment of extraordinary American transformation. Rapid industrialization, mass urbanization, the anonymity of the modern city. Chicago itself was a place where hundreds of thousands of people had arrived from elsewhere, where nobody knew their neighbors, where a charming stranger with a hotel near the World's Fair could meet and kill without detection. The city that made the World's Fair possible was also the city that made H. Holmes possible. Herman Webster Mudgett was hanged in 1896. The building he called his hotel was destroyed by fire in 1895. Arson, possibly. The World's Fair that had brought his victims to Chicago is now history. The electric lights, the Ferris wheel, the gleaming white city, all of it gone. But H. Holmes remains. Not because of what he built, but because of what he revealed. That charm can be weaponized, that intelligence can be turned entirely toward destruction, and that the most dangerous people are often the ones who seem, at first meeting, like the most interesting person in the room. Sources are linked below. We'll see you in the shadows.